The gifts arrived before the sun did. They came on the backs of servants dressed in their alpha's colors, the stone backpack in deep crimson, the ash veil in forest green, the golden run in hammered bronze. Processions that wound through the valley of the stone court, like rivers selecting new channels, each tributary bearing weight. The servants set their offerings in the great hall before the dais, and the hall, which had known 5 centuries of such ceremonies, received the accumulation without comment. The high stone arches held the morning darkness like a held breath. The torches on the walls burned without wind. She watched from the upper corridor. Her hands were cold where they rested against the balustrade. Her left hand slightly paler than her right, the veins visible in the gray pre-dawn, in the way that veins became visible when a body had been underfed long enough for the skin to thin over them. The 4 years had left their marks in ways the mountains always left their marks, in the economy of how she moved, in the particular attention of her gaze, in the way she had relearned to stand still and let time pass without trying to fill it. She had arrived at the stone court 2 days ago and had not yet eaten a full meal, not because there was no food, but because her body had not yet caught up to the reality of there being plenty, still rationing by instinct, still measuring out its trust of abundance in careful portions. The mark on her left forearm ran from wrist to elbow in a line too deliberate for any accident, a raised scar that had troubled healers in 3 villages, for the precise reason that it troubled her. It did not behave like a scar. It did not fade. On mornings like this one, when the air carried pressure and the torches below burned without wind, it held warmth that had no origin she could name. She pressed 2 fingers against it and breathed and watched the servants arrive. The first gift was territory. Gregor Vane of the stone backpack had sent a deed, rolled in wax-sealed leather, to 300 acres of old-growth forest bordering the northern ridgeline. His servant presented it to the hall steward with the gravity of someone placing a crown. 300 acres of timber and stone and running water, land that would matter enormously to anyone who had spent the last 4 years learning that security was measured in what could not be taken from you. Mira knew exactly what the deed was worth. She also knew what it meant that Gregor Vane had sent a servant instead of coming himself. The second gift was a necklace, hammered silver, set with stones the color of a winter sea, pulled from the vaults of the Ash Veil line. The last piece known to have been worn by Eloan Ashvale, who had been the final recognized female alpha in the Eastern Territories before the Council quietly amended the recognition laws to preclude the possibility of a successor. The necklace was an argument, not about Mira, about history, about a lineage she was still learning to understand. She carried in her blood, like a debt she had never agreed to assume. That Rendall Ashvale had sent it meant he understood what she was. It did not mean he understood her. The third gift was a horse, pale, enormous, the kind of animal bred over generations for power without savagery. She had heard stories of Caius Lorne's stables, the way one heard stories of ancient battles, with the specific exhaustion of being told about things one is expected to admire and cannot find it in oneself to reach for. The hall had been filling for an hour, and she had not moved from the balustrade. Below her, the gifts occupied the center of the room with the self-conscious grandeur of objects arranged specifically to be judged. She watched the servants straighten and re-straighten the deed, adjust the angle of the velvet case, settle the horse's bridle. She watched all of it the way she had learned to watch things on the mountain, without deciding anything yet, only cataloging. They told her about the fourth arrival just before dawn. The steward came to her himself, which was unusual enough to constitute a warning. He was a careful man, reed thin and gray at the temples, who had spent 40 years ensuring that ceremonies in this hall unfolded as they had always unfolded, and the quality of his discomfort as he climbed the corridor stairs reached her before his footsteps did. "The fourth has come," he said. His name. The steward's hands moved at his sides. Not a gesture, just displacement of some feeling he had nowhere to put. Cale Morn. She waited. He comes without pact designation, without formal territory claim. He paused, testing the weight of the next sentence before committing to it. He comes without a gift. Below, one of the servants laughed at something, the sound swallowed quickly by stone and distance. Mira looked at the mark on her forearm, and then she looked at the steward, and she said, "Tell them I will be down at first light." The window at the end of the corridor showed the sky beginning to change. Not light yet, but the particular quality of darkness that preceded light. A loosening at the horizon that meant the gray was preparing itself. She stood there after the steward left, and she felt the mark pulse once, a single slow beat, and she held very still until it stilled. The great hall in full morning was a different animal than the great hall at dawn. The long eastern windows pushed columns of pale gold across the stone floor, and the 3 alphas were already present, positioned near their offerings, with the studied ease of men who had rehearsed this particular posture. Gregor Vane was broad and black-haired, and the air near him carried something, a density, a pressure at the back of the throat, that was not aggression in any simple sense, but was the promise of it, restrained and patient. Rendall Ashvane was silver-templed. Still in the way, deep water was still. The kind of stillness that was not absence of motion, but readiness for it. Caius Lorne stood nearest the pale horse, with one hand resting on the animal's neck, and his youth showed not in his face, but in the controlled quality of his breath, in the careful deliberateness of a man who was working harder than the others to appear at ease. And then there was the fourth. He stood apart from the others, which was where the comparison to them effectively ended. He was not the tallest of them, nor the broadest, nor the most visibly armed. He wore riding clothes that had seen travel and made no apology for it. There was no standard on his chest, no clan mark on his collar, no ring on his hands to denote lineage or alliance. He stood with his back partially to the room, studying one of the old tapestries on the western wall. A hunting scene, she knew. 5 generations of stone court history rendered in faded thread, as though he had come here for the history rather than the ceremony. When she entered, he did not turn. The others did. Something in the base of her sternum registered the difference before she had fully processed it. She kept her expression level and crossed toward the center of the room. Mira Ashvane. Gregor Vane stepped forward first, because Gregor Vane was the kind of man who moved through every room as though the room had been waiting for him. And perhaps enough rooms had that he had stopped questioning it. He gestured toward the deed. 300 acres of northern forest, good timber, good water, 2 established trails that reach the high passes, land that builds something, land that keeps. She looked at the deed. She thought of the mountain she had lived on for 4 years, where the wind came sideways off the ridgeline every dawn, and the cold had opinions, and the only thing she had built was her own persistence, one morning at a time, out of nothing but stubbornness and fire. "Thank you," she said. It was not a yes. He heard it as one anyway, the particular deafness of men who had never been told no in a register they recognized. Rendall Ashvane moved with more economy. He did not gesture or explain. He simply opened the velvet case and allowed her to look at the silver necklace, and he said, "My grandmother wore this at the ceremony where she was recognized. I am told it belonged to your line before it came to hers. I am returning it." He closed the case. There is precedent in that return that the council will be forced to acknowledge. This was a more sophisticated offer than the land, and they both knew it. The land was wealth. The necklace was a legal argument embedded in an object, designed to initiate a conversation about recognition that she could not easily have started alone. She looked at Rendall Ashvane and understood that he was intelligent, and that every gram of that intelligence was in service of an outcome he had selected before he walked through the door. "You've given this considerable thought," she said. "Many years," he said. The word many carried something she did not entirely disbelieve. She turned to Caius Lorne and the pale horse. The animal was watching her with one dark eye that held a quality she recognized, the specific alertness of a creature that had learned to take the measure of whoever approached before deciding how to stand. Caius's hand tightened slightly on the bridle. He was perhaps 26, and the careful management of his face had the quality of a learned thing, a discipline installed over years to contain something underneath it that was not quite as composed as the surface suggested. She did not dislike him. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her slightly, that under different circumstances, in a different ceremony, in a world where she had arrived here by some other road, she might have even liked him. "She's called Thera," he said. "She responds to the first person who names her in her ear." It was the most personal of the three offers, and it had arrived, she thought, in the wrong register, intimate in form, but transactional in origin, like a letter drafted with great care for someone the writer had not yet met. She ran her hand down the horse's jaw, and Thera leaned into the pressure, and the warmth of her was a real, an immediate thing after the cold stone of the corridor, a warmth without agenda. She stayed with it for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she looked up and found she was looking at the tapestry wall and at the man standing in front of it, who had still not turned. She walked toward him. The room changed behind her. She did not need to look to feel it. The three alphas recalibrating, the studied neutrality of the servants suddenly strained. Gregor Vane's breathing shifted, a barely audible adjustment that registered between her shoulder blades like a change in weather. She did not slow. The man in front of the tapestry turned when she was close enough that not turning would have been its own statement. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two past it, with dark eyes that held the steadiness of someone who had learned patience from the inside out, not from instruction, but from duration, from the long practice of having no choice but to wait. There was a scar along his jaw she hadn't seen from across the room. He looked at her the way she had looked at the valley this morning, without the performance of neutrality that the others wore, without the strategic management of an expression being watched. He looked at her the way she had looked at the valley, trying to understand what she was seeing before deciding what to do about it. The warmth in her sternum moved. She did not name it. "You came without a gift," she said. "Yes. Why?" It was not quite a question. He received it, as it was intended. "Because anything I could carry here would have been a claim," he said. And I wasn't going to claim you before you agreed to it. The hall was very still. She was aware of it, the way she was aware of her own heartbeat. Present, rhythmic, background, to the more pressing business of what was directly in front of her. You have no standing, the court will recognize, she said. I know. Then you know what asking this costs. He looked at her. His gaze moved once to the mark on her forearm and then back to her face. I know what it costs the court, he said. I wasn't sure that was the same thing. She held that. She held it the way she had held the mark pulsing in the dark of the corridor, letting it settle, taking its measure, neither accepting nor refusing it yet. His name was Caius Morn, which meant nothing to any living record in the Stone Court's archives. She had looked, in the hours after the steward's warning, had taken a candle to the record room and searched for the name among pack genealogies and territory registrations and the old bloodline documents. Nothing. No pack registration, no territory claim, no heritage listed, no formal designation of rank or standing. He existed, as far as the official record was concerned, only in the present moment. She had encountered several kinds of erasure in her life. She recognized his. There are 3 powerful men behind me, she said quietly, who believe this ceremony has already gone the way it was supposed to go. Yes, and you intend to offer nothing that challenges that assumption except yourself. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but selecting. She had already learned this about him in the few minutes they had shared the same room. He did not speak to fill space. Each sentence was one he had considered. I don't have anything else to offer, he said, and I think you've had enough of men who do. The mark on her arm pulsed. Twice, in quick succession. She turned back to the room. The 3 alphas watched her return with varying degrees of managed composure. Gregor Vane's expression had moved from calculated patience into something stiffer, less rehearsed. Rendall Ashvane remained perfectly still, his gaze moving between her and Caius Morn, with the methodical attention of a man running numbers he did not like. Caius Lorne had released Thera's bridle. The horse had taken 2 quiet steps toward the side passage and was considering the third. She stopped at the center of the room. Gregor, he straightened, not quite visibly, but the room registered it. The land is real, and the offer is serious, and I don't doubt either. She kept her voice even. Not unkind, simply precise. But you sent a servant this morning. A muscle in his jaw moved. The deed stands regardless of how it arrived. It does, and I decline it regardless of what it's worth. She turned to Rendall Ashvane. This was the harder conversation, and she gave it the weight it deserved. He had spent years on this argument. She could see the architecture of it in every detail. The necklace chosen as much for what it argued as for what it meant. The historical precedent embedded in the gesture, like a blade inside a gift. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man whose honesty was entirely in service of an end he had decided on before she had a voice in it. You selected me because I fit the argument, she said, not because you know me. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precise economy of a man who recognized when he had been understood completely, he inclined his head. Not surrender, acknowledgement. She turned to Caius Lorne, and she softened slightly, because he was the youngest, and his offer had come from something less calculated than the others, even if it had arrived in the wrong shape. Thera deserves someone who can be entirely present, she said. I can't promise that yet. He looked at the horse. He nodded once, and it was real. The nod of someone who understood the answer, even if he had not expected it. She turned back to the tapestry wall. The room was silent, except for the torches and the sound of Thera making her unhurried way toward the side passage, which Mira thought was the most sensible decision anyone had made all morning. She walked back to Kael Morn, and she stopped in front of him, and she let herself fully register what she felt in his proximity. The warmth, the pull, the old certainty that had been living in her chest for years under names that did not fit it, waiting for a name that did. She had felt it first in her childhood, in the hour before her grandmother died, and had spent years deciding it was grief arriving early. She had felt it again on the mountain, waking at 3 a.m, with the absolute conviction that something was approaching that she was not prepared for. She had felt it twice on the road back to this court, in the dark of early mornings, the mark on her arm pulsing her awake into a silence that carried no threat she could locate. Each time, she had pressed her fingers to the scar and breathed and waited for it to explain itself. It did not explain itself. It simply persisted. She looked at his hands. No rings, no marks. The hands of someone who worked with them regularly, in ways that had left the skin toughened at the palms and careful at the fingers. She looked at the scar along his jaw that she hadn't seen from across the room. She looked at his eyes, which were holding her with the same quality of attention that she had noted when he first turned. Not strategic, not performed, not the managed gaze of a man who had rehearsed how to look at something he wanted. He was simply looking at her, the way she had been trying, for 4 years, to look at herself. "There's something I need to know," she said. "Ask it. When it becomes difficult, and it will, for longer than either of us wants, are you choosing to stand beside what I am, or who I am?" She had asked this of herself in every version she could construct, lying awake on the mountain with the documents under the floorboards and the wind coming hard off the ridgeline. She had asked it because she had lived long enough to understand how easily the two things were confused. How many people who would have died for a symbol would quietly abandon the person the symbol resided in when that person woke at 3 a.m, in fear, or was wrong, or was ordinary in the ways that symbols were not permitted to be. He considered her for a long moment. The steadiness in his eyes did not change. "I don't know yet who you are," he said. She waited. "I know what you carry. I've read what the mark means, and I know what the documents say about your bloodline, and I know what the system did to keep that bloodline from meaning anything." He paused. "But who you are is not in any of that. And I'm standing here without a deed or a necklace or a horse because I want to find out." His voice was quiet and completely level. "I think it's going to take years. I want to spend them next to someone the whole ceremony was designed to contain." The hall was very still. She said, "All right." She said it once, plainly, into the space between them. No more than that. Gregor Vane left first. He was not graceless about it. She noted this and credited him for it. He took the deed from the steward's table, tucked it under his arm, and walked out with the bearing of a man who had decided to treat a loss as a postponement. His servants fell in behind him like a tide, finding its way out. Rendall Ashvane remained a moment longer. He looked at the velvet case, and then he looked at Mira, and he said, "I will tell the council that this was your choice. Freely made, clearly stated. Tell them also," she said, "that it will not be the last one." He almost smiled. She thought it might have been real. He took the case and left. Caius Lorne was already gone. Only Thera remained near the side passage, patient and pale in the shadows, watching the room the way animals watch things, without judgment, without agenda, with the lucid attention of a creature that had not been taught to pretend otherwise. Mira stood in the empty center of the hall and felt the air change. Something that had been accumulating for a long time had discharged, and the room was larger now in the way rooms became larger after weather passed through them. The torches burned the same. The light through the eastern windows had moved a degree deeper into gold. The color that meant the in-between time was ending, and whatever was beginning now. With or without permission, she became aware of Cale Morn standing beside her, not behind her, not in front of her, beside. The steward cleared his throat with the delicacy of a man who has witnessed something he does not have a record category for. There will need to be a formal notation for the court record, given the unconventional nature of the proceedings. Note it as it happened, Mira said. He looked at her. He looked at the empty room. He looked at Cale Morn, who had offered nothing and carried nothing, and was standing with his hands loose at his sides, and his expression that of a person who was precisely where they had intended to be. "And what shall I record?" the steward said. As the formal outcome, she thought of the documents under the cabin floor. The genealogy sealed in waterproof leather, the bloodline records that had taken her 6 months to fully read and another 6 to sit quietly with. She thought of the cracked mirror that had shown her a face she was still learning to recognize. She thought of the mornings on the mountain when the cold was a living thing, and she had rebuilt the fire from nothing, and the nothing had been enough. Record the gifts that were offered, she said. Record that they were declined. She looked at the steward's quill, poised above the page. Leave the reason to the record itself. He wrote. The quill scratched across parchment in the old stone hall, and the sound of it was the only sound, and then it stopped. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. Winter light hard and clean across the old stone courtyard, the frost burning off the pavers in slow, thin wisps, the kind of morning that made no promises but concealed nothing either. Mira knew the news was already moving, out through the gates and down the roads and toward the council chambers and the pack halls, carried by servants and riders, and the particular speed with which information traveled when people were hungry for it. She knew what the council would say. She knew what Gregor Vane's correspondents would make of it, and Rendall Ashvale's, and the unnamed others who had been watching her return to this court from a careful distance, waiting to understand what she represented before deciding how to position themselves in relation to it. She had not come back to make that easy for them. Beside her, Cale Morn said nothing. She had already understood, in the brief span of their acquaintance, that he moved through silence, the way people with something to prove moved through speech, without apology, without the need to fill it, without treating it as absence. This would matter. In the weeks ahead, in the council chambers, in the confrontations, in the long, necessary work of whatever came next. This would matter in ways she could not yet fully map, but could feel the shape of, the way you felt the shape of a room before the candle was lit. She turned from the hall and walked toward the eastern passage, toward the courtyard, where the light was doing what light did at this hour, turning the shadows from gray to gold to nothing, burning away everything that the dark had allowed to be hidden. The passage was narrow and cold, and she moved through it the way she had moved through the mountain winters, not braced against the cold, but simply present within it, giving it no more weight than it deserved. Behind her, she heard Cale Morn's footsteps, unhurried, steady, the sound of someone moving at their own chosen pace, toward a place they had chosen to be. The courtyard was empty at this hour, except for a single palace guard at the far gate, who looked at her as she emerged into the light and then looked away. The look of a man absorbing information he had not yet decided what to do with. She understood that look. She would be seeing it often in the weeks ahead. In the council chambers, in the corridors, in the faces of people who had built their understanding of what the world permitted on a foundation that her existence quietly undermined. She did not hold it against the guard. She did not hold it against any of them. Particularly, understanding arrived at its own speed, and she had learned on the mountain that the most efficient thing you could do with the time between a person's recognition and their acceptance was to continue with your own business. The frost on the courtyard stones was burning off in slow, thin wisps, each wisp catching the early light for a moment before the warmth took it. She stood in the center of the yard and let the sun come fully onto her face, and she thought about the documents under the cabin floor and the 6 months it had taken her to understand them, and the other 6 months she had spent sitting with what they meant before she could move again. She thought about the cracked mirror she had found in the second year, propped against the wall of the supply room, which had shown her a face that was not the face she had arrived with. Sharper in the jaw, quieter in the eyes, the face of someone who had spent 2 years alone with the truth of themselves and had found it survivable. She had not recognized it immediately. She had come to recognize it slowly, the way you came to recognize anything that had always been true but had not previously been permitted to be visible. She heard Cale Morn come to stand beside her. Not behind, not in front. The particular quality of the space he occupied was the quality of someone who had thought carefully about where to put themselves and had chosen accurately. The mark on her forearm was warm. She did not press her fingers to it. For the first time in a very long while, she left it alone. Let it be warm. Let it mean what it meant. Let the morning do its ordinary work around her without the habit of bracing. The court will want a response before sundown, the steward called from the passage behind them. The court can send someone who knows what question they're actually asking, she said. And she did not turn around when she said it. She walked into the light, and the courtyard received her the way courtyards receive everyone, without ceremony, without comment, with the impartial availability of old stone that has held the weight of many mornings and expects to hold many more. Behind them, the hall settled back into its centuries of silence, the stone remembering, as it always had and always would, everything that had happened within it, and everything that had only now begun.